Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so Mehdi Hasan, the head of Zeteo News, which is an independent news channel which has been doing some excellent work. Them and Dropsite are kind of dominating the independent news lane right now. And Mehdi Hasan did an interview with Professor Jiang, who is an online personality who's been going viral for sort of like geopolitics analysis, and, you know, it wades into other things like religion, politics in general. But he has this weird slant where he kind of veers into Illuminati type of commentary, but he'll seamlessly transition into that from like real analysis about, you know, global politics and stuff like that. So it's this odd kind of content, this lane that he's carving out, which has been becoming like instantaneously popular, and people are getting on the bandwagon because he predicted not only that Trump would win, but that he would start a war with Iran. And he also predicts that America is going to lose the war with Iran. And so his project right now is trying to construct this broad worldview about like what the world's going to look like after collapse that comes from ending America losing the war in Iran. And it's not necessarily a picture where America fails or becomes a failed state. So I'll get into all that, but there's a lot of questions that arise with this guy, Professor Jiang. And so that is what Mehdi Hasan wanted to get into. And so here is him, for starters, asking him if he is a Chinese spy.
You're full of praise for China's role in trying to get peace in the Middle East. Here's what I don't get. You were caught filming protests by Chinese workers, famously in 2002 as a freelance journalist at the time. You were suspected by the Chinese government of spying. You were deported from China. Reporters Without Borders protested your deportation at the time. How did you get back into China? And why is it, some of your critics say, you have so little to say about China's role in all of this geopolitics? Is it because you're not allowed to currently?
Right. So when I started as a young journalist, I was subcontracted by PBS to do a documentary on China's WTO entry. And one major issue about China's WTO entry, of course, is worker rights. And at this time in China, there was a major restructuring of the state-owned enterprise system. So I was dispatched to northeastern China to film a worker protest. Unfortunately, the place was swimming with police spies, and I was arrested and interrogated for 2 days. I was held incognito for 48 hours, which is the maximum by Chinese law. And I signed a confession saying that I was a reporter and working in China illegally as a reporter, and the decision was made to deport me without charging me with any crime. And so I was allowed to come back in the country, but I was deported. So that was the story.
If they suspected you of being a spy, how did they let you back in? China's not known for being that trusting.
They suspected me of being a spy, but after a 48-hour investigation, after doing a thorough background check on me, they concluded that I was not a spy. And I was a journalist working to film in a worker protest. Look, the reality is that the best way to understand my situation in China is I'm essentially a Martian on Earth talking to Martians back at home in Mars. Like, I am not part of the Chinese system. I'm on YouTube, which is blocked in China.
How do they allow you to be on YouTube? This is what I'm not understanding. If you're blocked in China, why do they allow you to become... You're very prominent now. You're famous in the West. I'm sure the Chinese government has noticed that.
Well, most Chinese will have access to a VPN device, and that's what I use in order to access the internet.
You wrote for CNN that the Chinese government has built the Great Firewall to monitor and control their citizens' pursuit of truth. Does China control what you say now?
China does not control what I say because, again, I'm not talking to Chinese people. I'm talking to Westerners.
Hold on, that's what most people would say is China's great benefit. They might see, your critics might say, they're using you as a propagandist to come and say this stuff about Iran and the US on behalf of China. That would be what your critics would say.
Look, the reality is that this is a fair and legitimate criticism that I've been contemplating for the past 3-4 weeks. Because, you know, when I first started this YouTube channel like 2 years ago, I was expecting 5,000 viewers who would have a passion for learning, who would be as engaged with literature and geopolitics as I was. And over the past month, I've blown up all across the internet. And I don't think this is organic, but so I wonder if there are some governments or some entities that believe that my message should be amplified. It is possible I'm a useful idiot. And I suspect that there are many entities around the world who would like to amplify my message, including the Chinese government, but also including the Russian government, including some aspects of the American government, including some people who are hostile towards war.
Okay, so this is one of the most interesting aspects about this guy is that he's in China. So he has blown up completely with a Western and American audience, but he posts these videos to YouTube from China. So it's kind of an interesting thing because while it is possible for some Chinese people to access the internet through VPNs, which is what he mentions here, he has gained an enormous amount of prominence. And the idea that he's doing that without the Chinese government being aware makes no sense at all. So he speculates a little bit here that he could be a quote unquote useful idiot for various government entities that benefit from the message he's pushing. He describes it as being hostile towards war, although I don't know that that would quite capture it. But he does kind of sidestep the question of why is it that you are able to continue doing this project? Is it just because you are not criticizing the Chinese government? And the fact that he says, well, it's because I'm not talking to Chinese people, I'm talking to American people, that doesn't make a lot of sense. It's purely about the message, because if you were communicating to a lot of American people about a critical message of the Chinese government, you would not be allowed to reach as many people as you're reaching. You just wouldn't, especially as somebody who lives in China. He's operating from there. He's supposedly a teacher there, but he's not a professor. He's a high school teacher. So they get into that in a second here. But I think, the breadcrumbs are kind of there because he had been arrested by the Chinese government before he ever lived there, when he was doing a journalistic project there. He said they held him for 48 hours, questioned him, decided he wasn't a spy, and then let him go. Then, a few years later, he ends up in China, broadcasting to a Western audience and going viral while bypassing their firewall and their censorship. So that is the kind of indication that you look for when it comes to somebody who's been compromised, whether it's like on a street level by the police or higher up things. Like if somebody's gotten in trouble for something and then it kind of just rolled off their back and they got away with it, and then they continue to be in the world that they were in and continue getting away with certain things, that's usually an indication that they're doing some kind of informing. So, I mean, this guy doesn't seem to have been involved in any crimes at all. He was supposedly just a journalist there. If there was some reason that China was able to compromise him, we have no idea what that would be, but it kind of seems like that to me, because he was just in China doing some kind of project, and it seems like they made some type of deal that the fact that he is a prominent and very influential critic of America and American foreign policy just doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. At very least, it's definitely not a coincidence that they're allowing him to voice that opinion, because it's 100% true. Even if he was reaching a Western audience, he would not be able to be criticizing China. They would absolutely, even if he's using a VPN, they would come after him. They would shut him down 100%. So in this next segment, Mehdi presses Professor Jiang on his professor title, which is not his actual title. He's not a professor at any college. He's a high school teacher. And if you notice in his YouTube videos, he's usually just filming a YouTube video in a classroom, and he kind of pretends that there's students, but there don't really seem to be any students there. And he's kind of just creating that aesthetic that he's presenting to a college classroom. But at least from what I can tell, that doesn't seem to be the case. So here's Mehdi pressing him on that.
Just to be clear, your degree was in English literature, was it not, at Yale? It wasn't in international relations or national security. You're an English lit graduate, and you're not a professor. I know it's your YouTube moniker, but you're a high school teacher. You're not actually a professor.
Right. So when I went to Yale, I was actually a math and physics major. I was declared a math and physics major, but the Yale English department was very strong, and so I switched majors. So I have actually both a math background as well as an English background. And I'm not a professor. I'm not a professor. But I never said I was a professor. It's the internet who called me professor.
Hold on. You don't call yourself Professor Jiang on your YouTube channel.
I do now, but when I first started out, if you go way back to my early lectures...
It doesn't matter when you first started out. You do call yourself Professor Jiang and you're not a professor.
Look, there's a guy on the internet who calls himself the God, Have you interviewed him yet and asked him why he calls himself the God?
I think I'm good friends with a radio host called Charlemagne the God, but no one actually thinks he's a god. People actually think you're a professor. Just sticking with your analysis, you just said speculative analysis. To many people, that sounds like you're just making it up. You're speculating.
Look, I think that the problem with education is that it focuses too much on facts, too much on rigor, and not enough on imagination.
Too much on facts. Do you hear yourself? It sounds. I mean, what do you mean too much on facts?
Look. I know this sounds strange, but there is a difference between facts and truth,
okay,
right?
So Mehdi's pressing him here, and this is where I think it starts to unravel a little bit what his worldview is. It reminds me a lot of Jordan Peterson. This guy's very similar to Jordan Peterson. I think he could get a lot further than Jordan Peterson because, frankly, he's a little bit more convincing and also seems like he might be able to hold up a little bit better just from his temperament. I don't know that for sure, but it's a similar thing where this guy who has a pretty specific expertise and credential vastly expands the amount of subjects that he's talking about, finds some success on YouTube talking about these subjects, and is able to sort of overextend their expertise through that. So Jiang made some good predictions that Trump was going to win and that Trump was going to go to war with Iran. He also thought that Trump was going to run with Nikki Haley and that was going to be the reason that we went to Iran. So that didn't end up becoming true. And he apparently said at the time that whether Trump went with J.D. Vance or Nikki Haley was going to be determinate in whether or not this war thing happened, which it doesn't seem to have been determinate. Now he's saying that having J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard in the administration gives Trump an off-ramp, and he wouldn't have had that if he had went with a neocon like Nikki Haley. He would have been fully committed to this greater Israel project style of governing that he has done. And so what Jiang is doing that's working is he's taking all of these different pieces of analysis and he's putting it together into a story that is comprehensible for the average person. And that's why people are latching onto this, because people want to understand what's going on with these different nations and these different religions involved and what's the broad strokes of how history is going to unfold in these cases. And so Professor Jiang provides a story about that. I don't think his story is going to hold up. One of the things that he does in the videos that I watched is approaching all of this assuming that Trump knows exactly what he's doing. And he is saying that in a tongue-in-cheek way. He's saying, I know Trump's an idiot. I know he's a moron. Obviously, this is the stupidest thing you could ever want to do if you want to preserve the economy. But if you don't, and your goal is to crash the economy and then create some kind of new world order where America and Israel have more imperial power, then what Trump's doing makes sense, because by collapsing the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, essentially he's saying that the rest of the world would depend more on America and Russia for oil if things were to completely collapse around specifically that choke point of oil. That it wouldn't end oil distribution through the world, but it would actually make the rest of the world more dependent on the Americas, which is why Trump is trying to expand America. So that's essentially Jiang's theory. Now, it assumes, like he says, that Trump knows what he's doing and he's doing all of this on purpose. And I think that that's where this just obviously falls apart. And he's also doing a little bit of pandering. He's purposely both saying, let's agree Trump is bad and he's trying to collapse the economy and he's trying to create this new world order. But also what he's doing is very smart and he's actually a genius and he's doing this all on purpose and it's ultimately going to benefit the United States. So I think what Jiang is doing, because he's a lit major and he admits that he's pulling in literary analysis and storytelling as well as predictive stuff into his analysis. And I think what he's trying to do is play off of this stuff in a way that he can kind of hedge his bets, make predictions, and also play off of things that he knows people are interested in. And that's what makes it so interesting that he is open to and speculates on the idea that he might be some kind of useful idiot. So in this last clip, they mention one of the more controversial aspects of Professor Jiang, which is he gets into odd territory when talking about Israel. He talks about the greater Israel project of, expansion of the territory of Israel, but he takes it even a step further than that, talking about this thing called Pax Judeaica, which goes to a little bit more of an esoteric reading of what Israel wants to do. Essentially, you know, a version of global empire that Israel is in control of the Middle East as a whole. Essentially, that is what his theory of Pax Judeaica is. And he defends the use of that phrase here. To me, honestly, I think all of that esoteric shit like that, anything from that to talking about like the ancient demon entities, or any time the Israeli government is doing that, talking about Amalek or whatever, I mean, I think it's all bullshit. It just, my bullshit detectors go off so heavy when people factor that into their analysis, and especially if he's using it as a branding tool, this Pax Judeaica thing, calling videos that and using that to describe this worldview that he's going to keep coming back to, I do think is a signal to right-wingers that also like similar phrases. So here's Mehdi Hasan pressing him about that.
You don't just criticize Zionism or Israel, as many people legitimately do. You talk about this pretty far-right concept of Pax Judeaica, a new world order centered around Israel. You have a video called Dawn of the Jews, in which you seek to answer the question, why is it that Jews are so dominant? Surely you understand why a lot of people think at best you're trafficking in pretty anti-Semitic tropes, and at worst, you're a card-carrying anti-Semite when they see that stuff.
Okay, well, that is a very strong accusation. So can you please tell me what specifically I've said that you find offensive? Very much along the lines of Pax Americana, and Pax Britannica, and Pax
But you didn't say Pax
Magalica.
Israelica, you said Pax Judaaica. That implies all Jews. You know the tropes about Jews running the world. I wouldn't be okay if you said Iran is dominant, Saudi Arabia is dominant, Pax Muslimica. In fact, you know that there are many racists in the West who do believe that Islam and Muslims are trying to take over the world. I find that equally offensive.
Right. So I'm using a Latin convention, and so the Latin convention would be Pax Judaaica. It would not be Pax Israelica. I mean, like.
But you know where this concept comes from. It exists in far-right online circles. It's not some academic term.
Do you believe that the Greater Israel Project is a far-right conspiracy theory?
No.
What is it then?
I think it's a very real project being carried out by the Israeli government. I just don't call it Pax Judaaica.
Right, okay. So the difference between the Greater Israel Project and Pax Judaaica is this. Greater Israel Project is what the Israelis believe that Yahweh, their God, promised to their ancestor Abraham in the Bible. And this extends from the now to the Euphrates. And I could have just used Greater Israel Project, but I want to differentiate because I believe that Pax Judaaica is not an empire run by Jews, for Jews, by Jews. It is an empire run by transnational capital and secret societies in order to create an AI surveillance state throughout the Middle East.
Let me ask you this before we wrap up. What are your own politics? Where do you place yourself on the political spectrum?
I believe I've always been on the left. So I believe that wealth redistribution is very important. I believe in freedom of speech. I am anti-war. I'm anti-empire. I believe in individual autonomy. And so, unfortunately, I used to be left, but I think that, like, given my preferences and given my politics, I believe most people would consider me on the far right nowadays, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, so as far as this Pax Judaaica stuff goes, I definitely think it gets passed around in far right circles. He's saying that it relates to other, like Pax Americana, Pax Britannica, etc. But Mehdi Hasan is correct. He's saying Pax Judaaica. So he's kind of invoking Jewish language. And he says, well, I'm using Latin phrasing, but why would Latin phrasing refer to that? I guess because there's no word for Israel back then, I suppose. So, from what I've seen, I don't see that much overtly anti-Semitic from this guy. I'm sure it's there because the rabbit hole goes deep. And in my opinion, when you get into these esoteric and religious analyses of the situation, it leads to anti-Semitic thinking, in part because you stop thinking about actual populations of people and policies and on the ground thinking, and it becomes more about this like spiritual warfare and the spiritual nature of engagement between these different ideas and sects of people. And this Jiang guy makes a pretty secular argument, so he's an interesting figure. And I think he'll probably stay around. The thing is, he's betting on this whole stuff about the Iran war. If he's right, or at least is proven true a little bit about what continues to happen after Iran, then he'll probably stick around. But he makes a pretty bold prediction about what's going to happen here. And it's very possible that as, things go in some other direction, that this guy will kind of fizzle out. But I think a through line that's important to keep an eye on when it comes to people who might be ops, people who might have weird intentions in these political spaces, is people who will build up a very anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, very clearly identify colonial tendencies and capital accumulation and consolidation as problems, and private businesses stealing resources. People who can identify those as problems and as a sort of a permanent fixture of world power. But then at the crucial moment, when it comes to actually describing those in power and what should be done about it, they divert to something else like the Illuminati or religious groups like Jewish people, rather than talking about the sort of capitalist relationship between a country like Israel and America that leads to our joint interest in controlling the flow of oil through the Middle East, our joint interest in Israel becoming some kind of imperial power in the Middle East, which again is what Professor Jiang predicts with this whole Judeaica thing. So he references that and says that that's what he believes Pax Judeaica is, but that contradicts the idea that it's necessary to use that phraseology at all rather than the Greater Israel Project. It almost sounds like he's saying that Pax Judeaica is the secular way of describing it, whereas the Greater Israel Project is the non-secular, religious, spiritual way of describing it, because it references, what Zionists believe. But his description of what Pax Judeaica is goes much further to at least what we are told the goal of Zionism and the Greater Israel Project is. So I think people who make essentially a capitalist and anti-imperialist critique and then fail to identify that as the target of their critique are enormously sus, because they're people who are recognizing the momentum towards that idea right now, especially with the failure of right-wing populism, the failure of them to construct a real political movement. People are going to start making these anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist critiques because there's nothing left. There's nothing left for people who want to critique the war machine. And so people like this would rather divert the conversation towards the Illuminati or secretive groups and that sort of thing, because ultimately that allows the real power centers in the world to continue negotiating and continue their power plays. So that's what I would advise to keep an eye on with people like Professor Jiang, and I guess we'll see where he goes from here.
When Israel owns both parties, hundreds of thousands of innocent lives are ended. And what's interesting to me is how many people can see that and get that through their heads. It's kind of amazing. A couple years ago, if you would have asked me what I had thought that this many people would see the side of the Palestinians, I would have thought there's no chance.